Dakota Territory, winter of 1887. Snow swept in from the north like a living thing, swirling and clawing at the wind-battered rail station. The air bit through wool and leather alike, and the platform boards shone slick with ice. Linda Whitford stepped down from the passenger car with her carpetbag in one hand and hope clutched hard in the other. The train that had carried her across half the country gave one last shrill whistle before vanishing into the white horizon, leaving behind a silence so deep she could hear the snow striking the brim of her bonnet. She scanned the platform, searching for a man holding a sign or at least wearing a welcoming smile. But no one stepped forward. No tall figure in a brown coat. No hand raised in greeting. Walter Briggs, the rancher who had written so many careful letters, had promised to meet her here. She waited, shifting from one boot to the other as the cold crept up her skirt. Minutes dragged into an hour. The station master came out twice to sweep the steps, looking at her with a mixture of pity and impatience. Finally, a small voice broke the wind's lonely howl. "You need a home," said the little girl gravely, tugging at Linda's sleeve, "and I need a mommy." Linda turned to see a child of perhaps 7, dark-eyed and solemn, holding the mittened hand of a younger boy whose face was red from the cold. "I beg your pardon?" Linda managed, blinking back snowflake. "I'm Annie," the girl announced, as if that explained everything. "This is Tommy." Pause waiting. Before Linda could form a protest, the girl took her free hand, and the boy clung to her skirts. They led her off the empty platform, down a narrow path where the snow lay deep, toward a waiting wagon. A tall man stood there, reins in hand, his broad shoulders dusted with frost. He did not smile, but his eyes, gray as weathered iron, studied her closely. "You're the mail-order bride?" he asked, voice roughened by wind and silence. Linda hesitated. Yes. At least, I was meant to be." She glanced over her shoulder. "But the man who sent for me, Mr. Briggs, he didn't come." The stranger gave a brief nod, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. "Name's Elias Monroe." The girl piped up proudly. "That's my pa. You can come stay with us. Pa says no woman should be left in the cold." Elias lifted Linda's carpetbag into the wagon with one easy motion. "Climb in. It's a fair drive to the cabin." The ride passed mostly in silence, broken only by the horses' hooves crunching through snow and Annie's occasional chatter about the big stove waiting at home. Linda kept her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, wondering how her carefully planned future had unraveled in a single afternoon. When they reached the cabin, heat rolled out as soon as Elias pushed open the heavy door. The smell of stew filled the room, and Linda's frozen fingers ached as the warmth reached them. Tommy scrambled onto a bench near the hearth, while Annie set out bowls with the brisk efficiency of a child used to helping. "Sit," Elias said simply, ladling stew into a deep bowl and setting it in front of her. Linda tried to speak, to explain, to offer thanks, but her voice caught in her throat. She had been traveling for days, braced for a meeting that never came. Now this taciturn man and his solemn children were giving her food without asking questions. Elias ate in silence, head bent over his own bowl. The only sounds were the crackle of firewood and the children's quiet slurping. After supper, Annie tugged Linda toward the small room off the main cabin. "You can sleep here." Pa fixed the cot. Linda touched the coarse blanket neatly laid out and turned to Elias. I don't know how to thank you. This is more kindness than I deserve." Elias shrugged, setting his hat on a peg. "No one deserves to freeze." Their eyes met for a long moment, hers uncertain, his unreadable, and then he stepped outside into the night, leaving her with the soft hiss of falling snow and 2 children who seemed to have decided she belonged to them already. Linda sat on the edge of the cot, staring at her carpetbag. She was supposed to be Mrs. Walter Briggs by now. Instead, she was in a stranger's cabin, with no clear idea of what tomorrow would bring. Outside, the wind rose again, battering the little house. Inside, the warmth of a shared supper lingered, and for the first time since stepping off the train, Linda felt something besides fear. The Dakota winter stretched itself thin across the prairie, laying frost over fence rails and piling snow in the ruts of the wagon road. Linda Whitford woke to the sound of a rooster somewhere in the distance and the hiss of wind curling around the corners of the cabin. Elias Monroe had already left before dawn. His heavy boots never failed to creak on the threshold as he slipped out into the frozen dark. Annie and Tommy still slept, bundled in quilts, their breaths making soft clouds in the cold room. Linda lit the stove with hands that shook a little less each morning. She had learned which logs burned longest, how much kindling was too much, and which kettle spat the least when the water boiled. Life had its rhythms here, though none of them were her own yet. After breakfast, Annie coaxed Linda into lessons by the small table. The girl's sharp mind leapt ahead of the letters Linda traced with a patient finger. Tommy, stubborn and easily distracted, wriggled on the bench until she bribed him with a carved wooden horse Elias had left on the sill. The cabin filled with the scratch of pencil on paper, the sound of childhood repeating, B. D. Bad. By noon, Linda had stitched up a torn sleeve for Tommy's coat and begun mending Elias's frayed workshirt. It smelled faintly of smoke and pine. She found herself wondering about the man who wore it, who never spoke more than was needed, who fixed a broken hinge without a word, who let his children chatter without shushing them. That afternoon they went to town, Linda's first trip since she had stepped off the train. The horses strained against the traces, and the wagon wheels carved deep grooves through snow that had crusted to ice. Annie chattered about the mercantile's candy jars, Tommy about the sled he hoped to see in the window. Elias only flicked the reins and kept his eyes on the road. The town was a scatter of wood buildings huddled against the wind. Linda felt the sting of eyes on her before she even stepped down from the wagon. Mrs. Harrow, in her fur-lined coat, eyed her from the boardwalk with the sharpness of a hawk spotting a field mouse. "So you're the one Walter Briggs sent for," Mrs. Harrow said, her lips tight with disapproval. "Mail-order brides turning up without a groom. Shameful business. I hope Elias knows what folks are saying." Elias's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Linda kept her chin high, though the words burned. She bought flour, salt, and lamp oil while Mrs. Harrow's gaze followed her like a cold draft. By the time they climbed back onto the wagon, her hands shook inside her glove. The ride home was quiet. Annie sensed the mood and pressed herself close to Linda, while Tommy stared out over the frosted fields. Linda glanced at Elias, at the steady lines of his face, at the way he drove without looking her way. His silence was not empty, but full, a kind of shield he held up for himself and, perhaps, for her. That night, when the children were asleep, Linda sat by the hearth, still wearing her shawl. Elias came in from the barn, snow melting on his shoulders. He stood by the door, not taking off his coat, not speaking. "People talk," Linda said quietly, staring into the fire. "But silence can be louder than words. You don't have to defend me. I'm used to it." Elias's voice came slow and rough, as if unused. "You shouldn't have to be." Their eyes met for a moment, brief, uncertain, but warm like a spark catching on cold kindling. Then he nodded, set his gloves on the table, and went to his room. Linda listened to the door close and felt the cabin settle around her like a living thing. The wind still clawed at the walls outside, but inside, for the first time, it felt almost like home. The wind had softened with the first whispers of spring, but in Dakota territory, winter never gave up its grip all at once. The snow along the road had melted into patches of mud and slush. Icicles clung stubbornly to the eaves, glittering like cold teeth in the weak sunlight. Inside the cabin, warmth gathered from the wood stove. Linda sat near the window with Tommy at her side, tracing letters on a slate. Annie hummed under her breath, sewing crooked stitches on a strip of calico. Life in the Monroe household had settled into a rhythm, quiet, work-worn, but gentle. Elias still spoke little, but his steady presence filled the space like the sturdy timbers holding up the roof. It was on a gray Thursday afternoon, when the children returned from their lessons in town, that trouble came walking through the door. Annie dropped her schoolbooks with a thump, eyes bright with a fire Linda had never seen before. Her bonnet hung askew, and a smudge of dirt streaked her cheek. "What happened?" Linda rose quickly. Annie bit her lip, trying to look brave, but the tears came anyway. "I fought Clara Briggs." "Fought?" Linda knelt in front of her. "Annie, what on earth?" She said you ain't no real mama. That you're just some woman Pa brought home, 'cause no one else would take you." Annie's fists clenched. "She said Pa's a fool, and you'll run off when it gets hard. I told her she was a liar. Then I hit her." Tommy piped up from the corner, proud as a rooster. "She made Clara's nose bleed." Linda's heart ached, not for the insult, she'd weathered worse words, but for Annie's fierce loyalty. She brushed the girl's hair back from her flushed face. "Oh, Annie, you mustn't fight. She had it comin'. Annie's chin jutted out in a perfect imitation of Elias. When Elias came in from the barn, Linda told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable as always, but something in the set of his shoulders hardened. "I'll speak to Briggs," he said finally, hanging his coat. "No," Linda said sharply, surprising herself. "Please, Elias, let it go. It's only words." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "As you say." But that night, long after the children were asleep, Linda sat at the table with a lamp burning low, staring at her carpetbag. The words Clara Briggs had thrown stung more than she wanted to admit. Was that how the whole town saw her, a woman passed over, desperate enough to marry a stranger? She had come west to be wanted, but had she really found a home here? Quietly, she packed her few things. The faded ribbon from her sister, the well-worn prayer book, the extra pair of gloves. She set the bag by the door and stood there trembling, staring at the latch. If she left now, before dawn, she could walk to the next station and catch a train east. A faint sound stopped her, the creak of the floorboards, a shuffle in the dark. She turned. Elias stood near the hearth, barefoot, his hair mussed from sleep. He didn't speak. Instead, he crossed to the table, picked up Tommy's scarf, frayed from winter use, and began to mend it with clumsy stitches by lamplight. Linda froze, watching his broad hands guide the needle through the wool. He wasn't doing it because anyone had asked. He was doing it because the boy needed it done. Because no matter how silent he was, Elias Monroe cared. Linda's throat tightened. Slowly, she set down the carpetbag and slipped back into her room. When morning came, the bag was still by the door, but unpacked. The Dakota winter deepened with a vengeance. Each morning, snow lay heavier against the cabin door, and the cold seeped into the walls like a living thing. The sky stayed iron gray, the sun nothing more than a pale coin hidden behind endless clouds. Linda rose early, stirring the coals in the stove until they glowed cherry red. Tommy would crawl sleepily from his blanket, rubbing his eyes with tiny fists, while Annie, already stubbornly awake, tugged on her boots and demanded lessons before breakfast. In the evenings, the children curled close by the hearth as Linda read aloud from the single weather-worn Bible in the house. Her voice softened the hard edges of the wind howling outside. Elias Monroe worked from dawn to dusk, hauling water, splitting firewood, tending to the cattle, though the blizzard winds made every step treacherous. His broad shoulders were always dusted with snow when he came in, stamping his boots, his beard rimed with frost. And though his face stayed as unreadable as ever, Linda began to notice the quiet ways he watched over the children, and her. If the roof leaked, he fixed it before she asked. If the path drifted shut, he cleared it without a word. One afternoon, the storm struck harder than usual. A wall of white rolled across the prairie, swallowing fence posts and landmarks whole. Linda pressed her hand against the window pane, heart tight in her chest. "Where's Tommy?" she asked sharply. Annie glanced up from her stitching. "He went out just to see the calf," Annie admitted, guilt clouding her young face. Linda didn't wait for more. She threw on her coat, boots, and scarf, grabbing a lantern from the hook by the door. The wind met her like a living beast, slashing cold and wild. Snow blinded her eyes, stung her cheeks raw. "Tommy!" she shouted, voice torn away by the gale. "Tommy!" There, a faint cry, muffled by snow. She plunged forward, boots sinking deep, heart pounding so loudly she barely heard the wind. After frantic minutes, she spotted him crouched near the shed, shivering, his mitten caught on a loose nail. "Oh, sweetheart!" She dropped to her knees, yanking his hand free and wrapping him tight in her arms. The lantern guttered, nearly blown out, but she shielded it with her body as she stumbled back toward the faint shape of the cabin through the swirling white. When the door burst open, Elias stood there, eyes wide, face pale beneath the frost. He grabbed Tommy, swept him inside, then turned to Linda. For a long moment, no words passed, only the fierce grip of his hands on her shoulders, as though to make sure she was real. "You could have froze," he said hoarsely. "So could he," Linda answered, trembling but steady. Elias's jaw worked, his gaze uncharacteristically raw. "You didn't think twice." "He's your boy," she murmured. "And he needed me." Something in Elias shifted then, a crack in his iron composure, a spark of warmth and gratitude that shone clear in his eyes. He set Tommy near the stove, rubbing the boy's hands while Annie fussed over him with blankets. But every so often his gaze drifted back to Linda, lingering, thoughtful, as if seeing her not just as a stranger under his roof, but as something, someone, far more. That night, as the storm roared outside, the cabin felt closer, almost gentle. Tommy slept soundly, Annie curled nearby, and Linda sat mending a tear in her skirt by the firelight. Elias sat across from her, silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer distant, it was steady, protective, full of something unspoken. For the first time, Linda thought the cold prairie might not be quite so lonely after all. The snow began to recede in ragged patches, bearing earth that was soft and slick underfoot. Spring crept into Dakota territory not with flowers and birdsong, but with the slow retreat of winter's iron grip. The frozen creek behind the Monroe cabin cracked and groaned as water ran free beneath the melting ice. Sap bled from birch trees, and the wind no longer bit as sharply. Linda Whitford stood on the porch one morning, watching a pair of wooden birds swing gently from the eaves, a carving Elias had shaped with his own hands for Annie and Tommy during the long nights. Their wings clacked softly against one another in the breeze, like a quiet promise. Life in the cabin had grown warmer, easier, as if the thaw had seeped indoors. Elias had loosened his silence, though words still came sparingly. Annie no longer looked to Linda with wary eyes but with open trust, and Tommy's laughter filled the rafters. Linda had almost allowed herself to believe this fragile peace would last. But peace never lasted long on the prairie. It was just past noon when the crunch of hooves broke across the yard. Linda looked up to see a man riding hard through the slush. Arland Pike, the neighbor whose tongue wagged more than any windmill. His coat flapped open, his face red from exertion or anger, maybe both. He reined up hard at the fence, splattering mud, and bellowed without dismounting. "Monroe, you think you can hide a stranger woman in your house all winter and folks won't talk? You think the county judge won't hear about it?" Linda's breath caught. Annie and Tommy froze in the doorway behind her, wide-eyed. Elias stepped out from the barn, slow and deliberate, wiping his hands on a rag. He did not hurry. Elias never hurried, but there was steel in his gaze as he crossed the yard. "She's here for the children," Elias said flatly, his voice like the weight of an axe sinking into wood. "You've got no call to speak otherwise." Pike leaned forward in the saddle, smirking. "She's no kin to you. You'll answer for it." His eyes slid toward Linda, full of insinuation. "Maybe I'll take it up with the sheriff myself." Linda stepped forward before Elias could reply. Her gloved hands shook, but her chin stayed high. "You'll do no such thing," she said clearly. "This family has done nothing wrong. If you have business here, state it. Otherwise, leave." Pike's smirk faltered for just an instant at her steady tone. He opened his mouth to retort, but Elias had already moved closer. You've said your piece, Elias rumbled. Now get off my land. The rag dropped from his hand, his eyes sharp as flint. For a long moment, Pike seemed to consider pushing further. Then, with a muttered curse, he yanked his reins and turned his horse. Hooves splashed mud as he galloped off toward the ridge, his threats trailing behind him like smoke. The yard went still again. Linda let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Annie slipped her small hand into hers. Tommy clung to her skirt. Elias stood looking after Pike until the rider vanished over the hill, then turned to Linda. Don't mind him, Elias said quietly. Men like Pike talk loud when they've got nothing to say. Linda met his eyes. He'll talk louder now. Are you sure you don't care? Elias studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. I care about these children. About keeping them safe. He hesitated, and for the first time his voice softened, almost uncertain. And about keeping you here. The words sank into the still air like sunlight breaking through cloud. Linda felt her heart stutter. Elias. But he didn't give her time to answer. He stepped onto the porch, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a scrap of blue-checked cloth, one of her aprons, mended where the hem had torn. He held it out, rough fingers brushing hers. Figured if you're staying, he said gruffly, you ought to have this fixed proper. Don't mean much, but I'd like it if you'd wear it. Not just for the chores. Linda stared at the neat stitches, then at him. Are you asking me? Elias swallowed hard, his gaze steady. I'm asking you to stay. Not as a guest. As family. For good. Behind them, Annie whispered something to Tommy and the boy's eyes lit up. Mama? He asked hopefully, voice piping up into the quiet. Annie echoed him, a shy smile trembling on her lips. Mama, will you stay? Linda felt her throat tighten. The children were pressed against her now, clinging, trusting, not asking, but believing. She looked up at Elias. His face was solemn, waiting for her answer, though a flicker of fear hid beneath the calm. Linda tied the apron at her waist with steady hands. I'll stay, she said softly. If you'll have me. Elias' shoulders eased, the smallest smile ghosting across his lips. The kind of smile that, from a man like him, felt like a sunrise. The wind shifted, warmer than it had been in months. On the porch beam, the carved wooden birds knocked together gently, their wings clicking as if in quiet applause. Spring had truly come.